Okay, part two. Sorry it's taking so long to get to this, but it's been kind of a crazy week. Kind of doing job hunting, stuff like that, all kinds of weird stuff. So anyway, let's just get right back to this. Want to just take you through some applications of this example of interdisciplinary inquiry, the coming together of multiple representatives of multiple disciplines, and not just kind of doing something additive, but the idea of interdisciplinarity is the result of that boundary transgression where. Pause. So the idea is that the result of this boundary transgression where historian meets political scientist, meets communication scholar, meets psychologist, and what they produce in terms of not just an explanation, which is the lumpen youth theory, but the ways of investigating problems that deliver things like lumpen youth theory, the methodologies that they create, and we'll say later that's really the heart of interdisciplinarity is the way in which the result is greater than the sum of its parts, and everything from string theory and cosmology and physics to new institutional economics to peace and conflict studies are examples of just that. So sorry, kept bloody hitting the pause button. So let's kind of look at this assessment of the lumpen youth theory, right? The thing about it is if we compare it to, kind of what was already this sort of dominant paradigm, this dominant received view of what explains the horrific violence in West Africa, the new barbarism thesis advanced by journalist Kaplan, we can just instantly see the superior explanatory power of lumpen youth theory, right? For me, just personally, right? And that's as good a test, I think, as any. Is like, how well does a theory, does an explanation work for you? We all have our own kind of cosmological models. We all have our own ontological understanding of the world, and so a perfectly reasonable place to start with assessing theory is how well does it seem to make sense of the world that you're familiar with, right? That doesn't mean that it should just affirm what you know. Quite often it needs to challenge or may challenge what you know. But at least it's something that you recognize, right? And so the lumpen youth theory was in fact that. It was grounded on the experience of Africa that I knew, that I had, and not the experience of, or not the Africa as constructed by quote unquote others, right? The Kaplans who quite literally just fly in and fly out and make these grand sweeping claims about places they don't understand. So for one, the lumpen youth theory just simply rejected outright as completely vacuous on a conceptual and theoretical level. There was nothing in the Africans are barbaric, ergo that's why we have such barbaric war, that added anything to a 400-year-old racist trope that dominated, that continues to dominate depictions of Africa. Right? It was just as old an explanation for Africa, as old a description of Africa as one could find. It's just, in terms of the concepts that were advanced, there was just absolutely nothing innovative, nothing new, and much of it just factually incorrect or certainly questionable on an empirical level. I mean, it's hard to, expect theories to be sustained by evidence when they're formulated on the basis of touchdowns on airport runways. And so, and theoretically then, right? I mean, it was really just a kind of, there's a kind of a hermeneutic or a philosophy of science sort of language for this, but it was basically making all kinds of committing all kinds of logical fallacies, like predicting into the future beyond the range of data available and stuff like that. So it was just bad on every level, right? Whereas the lump and U theory, gave not only an empirically grounded theoretical explanation for the important problem under address, but also as we'll see, kind of raised new questions or help both raise and answer new questions. Because what the lump and U theory can help us do is something that Kaplan doesn't even think to ask, right? Given the approach that Kaplan takes to the study of a complex place or a complex problem like war. He never thinks to ask. Well, in fact, to the degree that he thinks about it at all, he makes an assumption that the future is more and more of what we see now. So it's just, as bad as it is in Sierra Leone, bad as it is in Cote d'Ivoire, bad as it is in wherever, it's only going to get worse as population pressures continue to grow. It's just I mean, you can have dire predictions and be perfectly correct, but the basis for them need to be solid. And what he never seemed to appreciate is his starting point was wrong, right? He describes an Africa that essentially is a continent of conflict. One of the great problems of representing Africa is that too often, Africa seems to be a country to people, right? And it's not. There are 54 countries in the continent of Africa. Africa's huge. It is so big that the continental 48 states of the continental United States fits within the continent of Africa 3 times, right? So it's massive. It's 54 countries. And the fact is it isn't and never has been a monolithic continent of conflict, right? Which, in fact, is not just a counter to Kaplan. It became very quickly for me one of the central animating questions of my career in conflict, which was this, right? Why, in some sense, isn't Africa a continent of conflict? Now that sounds like I'm doing just what Kaplan might do, but I don't mean to, right? What I'm saying is, which is reasonable to say, there are quite similar situations across Africa in terms of the presence of those factors, those causes we understand to be associated with conflict that burned Liberia and the whole Mana River basin there in West Africa to the ground. Given that the causal factors that we can understand as the explanation for those wars, the lumpen proletariat, the Rarimendam, the kind of cast out, and the psychological injuries that they sustain, and the way that gets fed upon by predatory rebel leaders like Fode Sanko or Charles Taylor, and then they get fed this this diet of ideological, fiery ideological stuff, and then they kind of, in this massive role reversal, displace all their pent-up humiliations and shame. There's all that in there, right? If it's fair to say, and it is, I think, reasonably fair to say that those conditions can be found pretty commonly across most of Africa, to varying degrees, but some level of it, it could be said, perhaps, is present in perhaps all the 54 countries of Africa. So why didn't all 54 countries go up in flames if those causes were present? Voila. The new barbarism thesis fails to even pose questions like this, certainly can't answer them. And so we are moving forward, and this is what the interdisciplinarity can really do for us, is it can not only help us understand what we're trying to appreciate, it can help us grapple with problems that we take on, but it can actually unexpectedly lead us into whole new areas of inquiry that we start seeing things and seeing problems or dynamics or things to explain that you couldn't see before. It's like having new lenses made as a result of these meetings across the disciplines. So this map, says, the map speaks for itself. Well, let me just say that no, it doesn't. Data never, ever, ever, ever speak for themselves. But what that map shows, right, is if anything, right, that yes, we can say and should say that Africa has had more than its fair share of violent conflict, and a great many of the people of Africa have had to endure the horrors and hardships of war far more than they were due, for certain. But the map does kind of make clear that it's not universally on fire, right? So if data then never speak for themselves, right? We just can't, and given the, I want to add this, given the problems that we address in this class, right? They weren't chosen at random. They are, the scourge of war, the persistent, but there's variations in the levels of growth and improvement, development or underdevelopment and poverty, right? And climate change. 3 problems not chosen at random, chosen precisely because they are big problems. They are wicked problems, right? And much hangs in the balance. Right? Given that, right, we can really no longer fall back on or rely on assessing theories in the way we long have done, which is using the language of parsimony or elegance. And what does that mean? It simply means that perhaps some of you have heard, perhaps all of you have heard of the concept of Occam's razor, right? Which, if you haven't, it simply means, or it's usually phrased as, when you're trying to, kind of solve a mystery, right? Occam's razor suggests that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one, right? Explanations that require, 30, 40, 50 items or events to happen in sequence in order for the thing to that you're trying to understand to happen, is such a unlikely scenario or scenario of scenarios, if you will, that it's probably not too likely to be a good theoretical explanation for why a war happened or why one country developed and another one didn't. So we've long kind of graded, if you will, theories by the simplicity, by the degree to which they could be honed down to just as few elements as possible. And so elegant theories are those that explain a lot with just a few factors or just a few variables, right? Perhaps the most elegant theory in history, we might say, right? I wish we were in class now together to ask. I'd love to hear if anybody thinks of it and sees it in the way I do. If I were to ask you what might be the most parsimonious, the most elegant, that which explains so much with just a little, what's the most elegant theory in history? What would you perhaps offer up? I think Einstein's theory of relativity, E equals mc squared, right? 3 factors, energy, mass, and velocity, right? Velocity squared. And just those 3 elements, those 3 factors, give us everything from explaining time travel to nuclear weapons. Right? It's quite a parsimonious, but that's a pretty rare event, and that's the world of physics. What I want to say here is what interdisciplinarity does in dealing with the problems that we are dealing with that are by their nature very complex. We can no longer afford to simply look for that which is most elegant or most parsimonious. We have to be willing to grapple with complex explanations for complex or wicked problems, right? So let me kind of just take it quickly through an example of elegance versus richness, okay? So I said, or I posed just a moment ago, right, that the real question for me became if all the factors present, or many of the factors present that we know cause conflict, are present across Africa, why didn't the whole continent blow up? This article that we're looking at by two World Bank economists, now they're with Oxford, Paul Collier and Anke Hoffler, is really, the one you're looking at is really responsible, I say, for launching the whole field of Civil War studies. Right? Now, the reason, and what I want to do here is I want to give it its due. I want to tell you what's really good about it and why it is so influential and why it's, responsible for what I do. But then I want to kind of point out its limitations. Right? So notice that on economic causes of civil war, the Collier-Hoffler model has a very good, elegant, parsimonious answer to the question of why isn't all of Africa burning if the factors for conflict are present fairly universally. And their answer is because wars aren't caused by grievances. Right? Now, let's just kind of think about that for a second. Right? Wars aren't caused by grievance. Right? And grievance meaning, complaints, things that people get angry about, frustrations, right? Causes that we get fired up about, right? We get sick of the corruption, we get, whatever. They're saying that, and they're quite clear in their analysis in their report, that for too long the dominant explanation for war and conflict has been grievance. They kind of call it the political science explanation, and they credit a well-known political scientist named Ted Robert Gurr, who wrote a book in 1973 called Why Men Rebel. And they're basically saying he's wrong, and so political science is wrong. Wars aren't about things that people get angry about. Wars aren't caused by grievances, which may strike you as odd, but they have some data to support it, right? If they're not, just to kind of put this in context, remember the lumpen youth theory, right? That's all about grievance, right? The lumpen youth theory of the not just of why the wars happened, but why they became so horrifically violent. The lumpen youth theory is grounded in grievance, in the transformation of a lifetime or a lived experience of shame and humiliation experienced by the outcast, the downtrodden, the off the grid, that gets explosively transformed into power in the context of a rebel movement. And so that whole lumpen youth theory is just front and center about the monstrously angry lumpen youth and their grievances of oppression and all the things that they've had to endure. Collier and Hoffler say basically bullshit. Just wrong, right? The World Bank economists, of course, think that economic incentives, meaning the gain to be made in war, is the real explanation for why war happens. So I should be clear about what they're trying to explain. They're explaining the onset, the the happening of war, right? Whereas Lump and Youth is doing much more than that. It's explaining kind of why wars happen, but also, perhaps most importantly, why they get so nasty as they did. Colleen Hoffler is asking a much simpler question. What explains, let's say in the context of Africa, you've got 54 cases to choose from, 54 countries. Why did war over a period of 50 or 60 years happen in the countries that it did and did not happen in the others? And they come up with, through statistical analysis, through regression it's called, a very parsimonious, a very elegant explanation. What they find is that grievance really doesn't have much to do with it at all, right? What they found is that when a developing country's economy becomes overly dependent on the export of primary commodities like agricultural goods, timber, minerals, what have you, when it becomes heavily dependent or reliant, when a good chunk of the gross national income is brought in as a result of exporting those primary commodities, you raise the probability of experiencing civil war. And they, found even a kind of magic number. And I should say, this is really good social science statistical work, right? Many people came after them and, attempted replication of the study and found what they found. And, so it's good social science in that sense. They actually found this kind of magic number that 33% primary the export of primary commodities constitutes 33% of gross domestic product, you are at the maximum probability of seeing civil war happen in your country. Now, that's as far as they really go, and it's as far as you can go with that kind of approach. As I said, it's quite transformative. It's quite influential. It launched, one variable, the percentage of, GDP accounted for by the export of primary commodities, at one value, 33%, launched a field, but also a huge debate, right? A debate that they win because they can largely sort of set the terms. In other words, they kind of create, in advancing their ideas, they do so in a way in opposition to existing, and that's the way it works, right? They kind of take on the existing or dominant received explanation, which is the politics, grievance, wars are about things, right? And they propose this alternative explanation that it's really about the economic incentives available that can, the kind of gain that can be made by waging war. And that proxy, that the way they kind of demonstrate that there is gain to be made by waging war in a country, that that percentage, that high percentage of GDP accounted for by primary commodity exports, is that way of demonstrating the potential for economic gain in war. So you've got their greed model versus the grievance model, which is politics, lump and youth stuff. But they kind of win it right out the bat, right? Because they sort of set the terms, and we sort of instantly have this kind of orthodoxy, right? That we've now got all these kind of economic rationality kind of arguments, and they remain very, very influential. And there's important elements to all that stuff, right? But I would just ask us, well, what do we do with all that data we have, all that lived experience that we know to be relevant and seemingly quite an important and convincing explanation for not just why war happened in Sierra Leone, but why it happened in as horrifically violent a way as it did. And so I'm left, saying, wait a minute, can the percentage of gross domestic product accounted for by the export of primary commodities really help us understand the widespread, intentional inflicting of humiliation and degradation, and these just vicious assaults on human dignity by the hacking off of hands and feet of little babies and raping old women and babies, and just and raping men. And I mean, can that, does this economic variable convincingly give you an explanation for that stuff? It doesn't for me, right? So, I remain asked, I'm still left asking, was the war and all of its monstrosity really just a function of a cost-benefit calculation on the part of some rebel leaders that said, hey, we got this money to be made if we wage war? Well, there might be something to that, right? And then sell the idea and other things to the people that waged the war. But so it was appreciation of Collier and Hoffler for the rigor of its methods and the way it was, so landmark and launching a field, but the limitations of it to really give us, or give me and those of my ilk, answers to the questions that are equal or sometimes more importance. It is in all of that lie the origins of my pluralism, my inviting, and my comfort with multiple methods, multiple methodologies, multiple ways of coming to know things. So the Collier and Hoffler model made intuitive sense and was massively influential. I hope I've tried to give it its due, right? Their methods were sophisticated. Well, in some sense, they're not wildly crazy sophisticated. I mean, they're kind of standard, just multiple regression models. So very mainstream, I guess, methods of doing social science. They were properly performed by Collier and Hoffler, as has been demonstrated by many others who've replicated their findings. The 33% was actually ticked around a bit. It kind of varied between 28 and 33%, but that was the result of good social science interaction among scholars, right? So, and what I think it did at the time, why I was at first, kind of appreciative of it, is it seemed also, like the lumpen youth, right, there was an element to it. It just, if you don't dig too deep, there's a kind of, at a superficial level at least, a fit with what we at least thought we knew about economic incentives and the related issue of war and primary commodity exports. What kind of exports? Well, particularly those, right? So what I'm saying is that we were sort of at this time kind of becoming aware that, if you haven't seen the film Blood Diamonds, it's worth seeing. We were becoming aware, thanks to some good reporting, not the Kaplan-esque kind of stuff, but on child soldiering, the centrality of diamonds to the rebel factions at war in West Africa. If you want to understand why so much of what the RUF did seemed contrary to a strategy that would win the war, this helps you understand that. And it's what helped me get my head around it too. It's like, oh, they might not actually be trying to win a war. If there really is an economic incentive, there's an economic gain to be had simply waging war, not winning it, but just fighting it. And while you're fighting it, you happen to have control of these diamond mines, then you can continue to enrich yourself to some pretty staggering degrees, right? So I hope I'm giving it its due, right? There's some real explanatory power and leverage in that stuff, but there's also stuff that's missing. So there remains the need, I argue, right, to look beyond just the economics, right? it still persists, right? Does it help us explain all that vicious rape and hacking and mutilating of their fellow human beings? I just don't think so, right? And so again, all various kinds of social science researchers, qualitative researchers in particular, right? Those who do a lot of field work were contributing, I think, still contribute, some of the most important data to the field, right? The thing about economists is that they just rarely ever leave their office, right? They just kind of estimate their regression models and things like that in their computers in their office, and sometimes make grand sweeping claims about how to, produce economic growth and end up, making millions of people's lives miserable because they were wrong. There are some economists who do go to the field, and I'll point them out at some point. But the ethnographers, the anthropologists, the sociologists, the political scientists, the historians are out there doing field work, trying to understand the region, why it burned, was grounded on the kind of predicating assumption that you probably ought to speak to people that fought the war, suffered from the war, were victimized, were the victimizers, right? Both victims and perpetrators. And, that's something that Collier, of the Collier and Hoffler, he just, for the longest, I don't know if he still believes it, but he famously said, talking to perpetrators of war crimes can give you no data of any value whatsoever. They'll just lie to you or whatever. And he's been proven wrong so badly on that. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. I've discovered personally in my consulting on conflict zones, it's really quite remarkable what people who have committed war crimes and atrocities will be willing to tell you about their experience of war. And so, I want to leave you with this, econometric models do have their place. But, some methods are just good at other things. Only ethnography can give us data like this. If you want to know why, there's so much, hard to explain, hard to understand sexual violence, and also the apparent choice of young girls and young women to sign on with a rebel faction that's doing such horrible things to its community, to its village, even to its family members. Why would a young woman join a rebel force that just slaughtered her family and village, right? Well, it really does require people to ask them first. Give them a chance to tell you, perhaps, how they saw the world, how they saw what choices were available. So here we have a well-known female fighter for the RUF, and she has this: in a war machine that was a mechanism for looting, one of the main incentives to be a fighter or to be a girlfriend of a fighter was the spoils of war, right? That's the scholar speaking, but then the actual woman. You had your family, and they did not have any food, she says, right? If you did not have a relationship with a commando, meaning kind of like a rebel, or hopefully, right, a rebel leader, right? If you did not have a relationship, meaning if you didn't sleep with one, how would your family survive? You had your mother, your father, your brother, your sister, uncle. If you didn't love, meaning if you didn't have sex with a commando, they would not get food. Pseudonym nom de guerre bientôt. And so here we have, right, Collier says, people that wage war and do bad things won't tell you. I think she's being pretty brutally honest here, right? She signed on with a rebel faction, established a sexual relationship with someone as high up the hierarchy as she could perhaps manage or find, in order to not just protect the family, but allow them to perhaps thrive, to eat well, and so there's a lot to be said for getting outside the economics office, right? So the plausibility, how can we assess that? How can we ask is it a good theory? How well does it match the circumstances? Well, here's what a young man who fought in Liberia said, right, after the war. As for me, for a long time, I had no care for village tradition. I had been to Liberia to kill using AK-47 and with a knife. I have eaten human flesh and taken drugs as well. I am a cursed child because I have caused harm to my mother, who died with that sorrow in her heart. Now I am not sure if I can go back to my community again and whether they will accept me. Now there's just so much we don't have time to do, but you can hear in this young person's lament the backdrop of the lumpen lived experience and the way that that informed his grotesque participation in war. And we come to see, in fact, right, I kind of said it before, it was like, how do I get my head around this? How do I make sense of the, explain the inexplicable? There is, and I should point this out, when we move to the interdisciplinary space, I'm kind of posing, say, economics, the discipline, versus, say, conflict studies, the interdisciplinary approach. It doesn't mean we kick out economics from the research club, right? No, right? The idea, and as we move towards complexity theory, we'll see that complexity theory is precisely on the cutting edge because it has maintained very important elements of the constituent disciplines of which it is comprised, right? So take this, for example. If we want to understand the amputations, right? Well, how's this, right? Amputations, it is said, were an instrument of terror, a strategy to destroy social networks and norms, including through upsetting age-based power arrangements. A lot of African societies are gerontocratically ordered societies. You know, you have kind of age-based secret societies, and your, kind of elders have the power and all that kind of stuff. By young 16-year-olds carrying AK-40s. I saw this in my work in Ivory Coast. There, the village elder, the village chief, even, right, has been usurped by a 16-year-old because he's packing an AK-47. Right? And so here we see, amputations were an instrument of terror, a strategy to destroy social networks and norms, including through upsetting these age-based power arrangements, a tactic to ensure the allegiance of recruits by alienating them from their communities. So what's the answer to why would they do this to their own communities? Because the leaders, the Fode Senkos, that son of a bitch that led the Revolutionary United Front, he was, instrumental in getting these young, forcibly, recruited 15-year-olds to go back to their own home villages and commit these atrocities against their families, against their neighbors. And when I first got into this field, I was seeing it from afar, and I'm like, why is this group doing this? Why is the RUF engaging in these tactics that are so counterproductive, so counter to the, goal of winning a war, right? Well, again, here it is. This is the rationality, economic rationality in some sense, or I should say the concept of rationality that is at the heart of the discipline of economics. There's a kind of interest served that helps us understand the seemingly inexplicable. It's a tactic used by militarily weak forces to be able to exercise a level of power and control that they don't have militarily. Right? It's a way to, get recruits to become a disciplined corps of fighters, because they no longer have families and neighbors and communities to go home to because they were just forced into alienating themselves from them by going back to their home village and hacking off hands and feet of their communities, of their friends and neighbors. A central device in garnering international attention and involvement. Fodesenko, I may say he's a son of a bitch, but he was really good at PR. He was rather charismatic, and he would literally speak to the BBC by phone, by cell phone, and then be broadcast all across the world. So this guy who like flunked out of everything, flunked out of grade school, flunked out of the army, was a photographer and got kicked out of the army. He just failed everything, right? All of a sudden has the attention of the entire world through BBC. And in doing so, bringing attention, both good and bad attention, to the conflict. So, the community of scholars, the Peace and Conflict Studies, community of scholars investigating organized armed violence or war, right, really can be said to share perhaps only one thing, and that's a vision of a world less violent. Right? When we become willing to take risks, to transgress the boundaries of our chosen disciplines, get outside our comfort zones, reach across the aisle, as it were, and historian meets economist, psychologist meets economist. When those things start to happen, we take our first steps towards realizing that vision of a less violent world. But let me just make something very clear. This will perhaps seem unexpected, but make no mistake, not everybody likes interdisciplinarity, and there are reasonable debates to be had, and I had them for years with a colleague back in the States, and there are unreasonable. Meet the unreasonable kind, right? I don't know if any of you have heard this thing called the Grievance Studies Affair, a hoax perpetrated, academic fraud was committed by these three. She is the kind of lead architect of this organized assault on the modern university. They called it the Grievance Studies because what they did is over the course of I think about a year and a half or so, they wrote a bunch of like really bogus, senseless journal articles and submitted them to what they describe as like leading journals in the disciplines or in the field. And they were just completely contrived. They were completely made up, and they were intentionally ludicrous. Right? I mean, the very basic ideas that they were advancing in the claims they were making were just just on the surface, utterly ridiculous, right? And yet, they managed to get, say, I think they submitted, about 24 articles to about a dozen or so journals, leading journals, they say, and got, I think, a couple published. Almost all of them were rejected. They got a couple of revise and resubmits, but they considered this like a big success, getting one or two, kind of past the goalie. I think these folks are angry, embittered, failed academics. I don't exactly know what their beef is, but I just want to show you what kind of opponents you will have as you seek to grapple with real pressing contemporary problems from an interdisciplinary perspective. Okay, they argued that their target in the academy was postmodernism. Right, that's who they were really kind of going after. That it's all postmodern bullshit. Right. So, and they said they submitted these bogus articles to the leading journals in these postmodern fields. Right. And got so many of them published when so many was like a minuscule proportion. Most of them were flatly outright rejected. But I want you to just kind of take a look here. When we say leading journal, and that's the language they keep using, right? I want you to think about who they attacked, right? I gave, some of you may remember, I gave a presentation at the Bangkok Peace and Conflict Resolution Study called Defending the Vulnerable. Um, and I had this data in it, right? A leading disciplinary journal like, say, the American Political Science Review, you can see here, these are journals that have been publishing, right, from what, 80 to over 120 something years, right? The journals that they assaulted, the ones they sent these bogus um, uh, articles to, have an average life or number of years in publication of about, I think it was like 12 years, as opposed to the average being something like 110 years for these disciplines, right? So my point being, right, if we just compare the journals to which they sent these bogus articles, this made up stuff, for one, they weren't all or most of them, in fact, were not postmodern journals, right? In fact, the most common element or the most common theme in the journals that they attacked is that they're gender interests. They're either feminist or kind of gender-based stuff. So it would seem to me that their beef is not with postmodernism. They don't like women, or they don't like feminism, or they don't like gender or something, right? And they are assaulting journals that are very young, and because the reason the journals are young is because the interdisciplinary areas of inquiry that produce the journal are themselves brand spanking new, right? They sent something to the Journal of Fat Studies. Now, we can maybe think fat studies may not sound like an important or an august area of study in the modern academy, but it's a real issue, right? Everything from just the public health crisis in my country that is obesity, to one of my biggest fears is, my daughter is going to come to Thailand someday, or and every woman I've ever met, it seems like, in Thailand says that she complains about how fat she is. When this is nobody, I've never met a fat Thai woman. I'm so fearful that my daughter would hear that and have that adverse body image reaction, because there are just children killing themselves in my country over body image, and so these are important questions, and these are new questions, and they're new fields, and so they are vulnerable to the assaults of those scumbags that I just had on the screen. Their beef is with new, with contemporary, with that which goes after institutions of power. And I just say we don't let them get away with it. Okay, that's the end of part two. The last thing will be just some complexity stuff. Okay, cheers.